The Boeing 777's cabin hummed with the steady drone of engines at 37,000 feet, passengers lost in movies and magazines, unaware that their flight path had just become a national security nightmare. In row 10, seat C, Artemis Vale slept with her baseball cap pulled low, designer jeans wrinkled from the 6-hour flight from Los Angeles. Her net worth exceeded most small nations' GDP. Built from a revolutionary aerospace materials company she'd founded at 26. But none of the 312 souls aboard Flight 447 knew that beneath her unassuming appearance lay something far more dangerous than wealth. The first hint of trouble crackled through Captain Morrison's headset at 14:47 Zulu time. United 447, this is Denver Center. We're showing an unidentified aircraft on an intercept course, bearing 270, 15 miles and closing. Maintain current heading and altitude. Morrison's co-pilot, Jenkins, shot him a glance. In 20 years of commercial aviation, neither had heard that particular tone from air traffic control, calm, but carrying an undercurrent that made seasoned pilots' blood run cold. The unidentified aircraft wasn't responding to radio calls. It had appeared on radar screens like a ghost, flying a trajectory that would bring it dangerously close to their passenger jet. 3 minutes later, the situation deteriorated. United 447, be advised, military assets are being scrambled. Continue present heading, do not deviate. The controller's voice had shed its professional veneer. Through the cockpit windows, Morrison spotted them first, two dark specks against the infinite blue growing larger with each passing second. F-16 Fighting Falcons, their angular silhouettes unmistakable even at distance. But the mystery aircraft had vanished from radar. In row 10, Artemis stirred as turbulence shook the cabin. Her hand instinctively moved to her left shoulder, fingers finding the small scar hidden beneath her cotton shirt, a reminder of ejecting from a burning FA-18 over the Persian Gulf 7 years ago. Her call sign then had been Phoenix, earned not for rising from ashes, but for the way she'd guided 3 crippled aircraft home when everyone expected them to burn. The intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison. We're experiencing some air traffic delays. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. His voice carried the particular strain that told experienced travelers this wasn't about weather or congestion. Artemis lifted her cap slightly, ice-blue eyes scanning the cabin. Something was wrong, very wrong. The way the flight attendants moved with forced casualness, how the businessman in 8A kept glancing toward the windows, the subtle change in engine pitch that most passengers would never notice. Her combat instincts, dormant but never truly gone, began stirring like coals touched by wind. She had no idea that in 90 seconds, Captain Morrison would make an announcement that would change everything. The mystery began with radar ghosts and military intercepts, but it would end with a question that would echo through aviation history. What happens when the most unlikely passenger becomes the only hope for 312 lives hanging in the balance 37,000 feet above the Colorado Rockies? The answer lay sleeping in row 10, dreaming of skis she'd once owned and battles she'd thought were behind her forever. Captain Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the intercom switch. The words he was about to speak had never been uttered in commercial aviation history, but the voice in his headset from NORAD had been crystal clear. Find anyone with military flight experience. Now, the unidentified aircraft had reappeared, this time accompanied by something that made experienced air traffic controllers go silent with dread. Ladies and gentlemen, Morrison began, his voice steadier than his hands. This is highly irregular, but we have a unique situation. If there are any passengers aboard with military aviation experience, specifically fighter aircraft, please identify yourselves to the flight crew immediately. The cabin erupted in nervous murmurs. Flight attendant Patricia Chen moved down the aisle, her trained smile masking the fear in her eyes. She'd been briefed by Morrison. The mystery aircraft was now broadcasting a signal that suggested hostile intent. The F-16s had visual contact but couldn't engage over populated areas. Something else was needed. Someone else. Artemis sat motionless for 15 seconds, her mind racing through calculations that had once meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The probability matrices, threat assessments, and tactical considerations flowed through her consciousness like water through a familiar riverbed. She could feel the eyes of nearby passengers on her, could sense the weight of a decision that went far beyond personal comfort. Her fingers found the small phoenix pin hidden inside her jacket pocket, a gift from her squadron mates, the only physical reminder she'd kept from her military life. The metal was warm against her skin, and for a moment she was back in the cockpit of her FA-18 Super Hornet, call sign Phoenix 1, leading a formation through hostile airspace with nothing but skill, instinct, and an unshakable belief in bringing everyone home. She stood up. "Here," she said quietly, her voice carrying despite its softness. Patricia Chen turned, relief flooding her features as she approached. Other passengers craned their necks, expecting to see some grizzled ex-military man. Instead, they saw a woman who looked more likely to be heading to a yoga retreat than a combat zone. "I'm former Navy," Artemis continued, moving into the aisle. "FA-18 pilot, 7 years active duty." She didn't mention the classified missions, the medals locked away in a safety deposit box, or the fact that she'd been one of only 12 pilots cleared for the most sensitive intercept operations in the Pacific Theater. Patricia's earpiece crackled with Morrison's voice. "Bring her forward, now." As Artemis walked toward the cockpit, she caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Her. From the businessman in 8A, she looks like she's barely 30, from a woman in first class." The doubt in their voices was familiar. She'd heard it in briefing rooms and ready rooms throughout her career. Being underestimated had always been her greatest tactical advantage. The cockpit door opened, revealing Morrison and Jenkins hunched over their instruments. Multiple radio frequencies chattered with controlled urgency, and the radar display showed a constellation of contacts that painted a picture no commercial pilot was trained to interpret. Morrison looked up as Artemis entered, his relief palpable. "Thank God," he breathed. "I'm Captain Morrison. This is First Officer Jenkins. We need to know what we're dealing with." He gestured to the radar display. "That contact appeared 20 minutes ago, heading directly for us. It's not responding to any communication attempts." Artemis studied the display, her trained eye immediately cataloging speed, altitude, and approach vectors. The contact's flight pattern wasn't random. It was executing a classic intercept profile, one she performed dozens of times in training and 3 times in actual combat situations. "It's not trying to ram us," she said finally, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised both pilots. Morrison's eyebrows rose. "Then what?" "It's hurting us." Artemis traced the contact's path with her finger. "Look at the approach angle. If it wanted to hit us, it would be coming in from 12 o'clock high. Instead, it's positioning itself to force us onto a specific heading." She paused, studying the terrain display. "The question is where it wants us to go and why." Her words hung in the cockpit air like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about their situation. Outside the windows, the F-16s maintained their escort positions, but Artemis knew that conventional fighters would be useless against whatever was orchestrating this aerial chess game. The real battle was just beginning, and it would require skills that had nothing to do with commercial aviation procedures, and everything to do with thinking like a predator in 3-dimensional space. The radio crackled with a new voice, cold and electronically distorted. "United 447, alter course to heading 290. You have 2 minutes to comply." Morrison's face went white. Jenkins reached for the transponder, but Artemis was already calculating angles, distances, and possibilities that existed in the razor-thin margin between catastrophe and salvation. She'd spent 7 years learning to fly in situations where surrender meant death and hesitation meant failure. Now, 37,000 feet above Colorado, those lessons were about to be tested by an enemy that had just revealed itself as something far more dangerous than a simple terrorist with a stolen aircraft. The hunter had become the hunted, but the prey was about to show teeth. The electronically distorted voice repeated its demand, this time with an edge that made even experienced pilots' hands shake. Morrison looked at Artemis, his 20 years of commercial experience suddenly feeling inadequate. She stood behind the center console, her posture radiating a calm that seemed almost supernatural given the circumstances. "Don't comply," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the radio chatter and engine noise. "Not yet." Jenkins started to object, but Artemis raised a hand. "Look at your fuel gauge. We have approximately 43 minutes of flight time remaining at current consumption." She pointed to the navigation display. "The heading they want puts us over the least populated area in a 300-mile radius. They're not trying to crash us into a city." Morrison's training screamed at him to follow air traffic control directives, but something in Artemis's tone, the absolute certainty of someone who had faced death in combat, made him hesitate. "Then what do they want?" "They want us isolated." Artemis moved to the radio panel, her fingers hovering over controls she hadn't touched in years but still knew by muscle memory. "Captain, I need you to contact Denver Center. Tell them Phoenix 77 is requesting permission to assist United 447. Phoenix 77. Morrison's confusion was evident. "It's my old call sign. They'll know what it means." Artemis's eyes never left the radar display, where the mystery contact had begun a slow orbit around their position. "And Captain, when you make that call, make sure they understand this isn't a request. It's a notification." The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The uncertain passenger from row 10 was gone, replaced by someone who moved with the predatory grace of a fighter pilot in her element. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions in microseconds, and both pilots found themselves responding to it instinctively. Morrison keyed the radio. "Denver Center, United 447. We have a situation. Phoenix 77 is requesting permission to assist with our current traffic issue." The pause that followed seemed to last forever. Then, "United 447, stand by." Another pause, filled with background chatter that suggested multiple agencies were suddenly very interested in their conversation. "Phoenix 77, Denver Center. Authentication code." Artemis took the microphone without asking. "Bravo 7 Alpha 9 Tango Phoenix. Confirming. Artemis Vale, Lieutenant Commander, United States Navy, retired. Squadron VFA 103, deployments classified under National Security Directive 774. The radio fell silent except for the constant hum of interference. In air traffic control centers across the region, duty officers were frantically accessing databases that most of them didn't know existed. Artemis Vale's service record was buried under layers of classification, but her call sign Phoenix 77 was flagged in systems that would immediately route any mention to the Pentagon. "Phoenix 77, this is Falcon Control." The new voice carried the crisp authority of military command. "Your request is approved. United 447 is now under joint civilian-military coordination. What do you need?" Artemis allowed herself a small smile. "Falcon Control, I need a tactical assessment of the contact. Speed, altitude, probable aircraft type. And I need to know what assets you have in the area besides the Fighting Falcons." "Phoenix 77, contact is maintaining 28,000 feet, speed 420 knots. Aircraft type unknown. It's not matching any profile in our database. We have 2 F-16s on station, with 2 F-22 Raptors en route, ETA 12 minutes. "Negative on the Raptors," Artemis said immediately. The contact is staying below 30,000 feet for a reason. If you bring fifth-generation fighters into this, it might escalate beyond what we can control." She paused, studying the radar pattern. This isn't random harassment. Someone knows exactly what they're doing, and they're following rules of engagement. Morrison watched her work, recognizing leadership when he saw it. "What aren't you telling us?" Artemis turned to face him, and for a moment he saw past the calm exterior to something that made him understand why the military had classified her service record. "Captain, that aircraft out there isn't trying to harm us. It's trying to communicate. The question is whether we're smart enough to listen before someone makes a mistake that gets all of us killed." Outside the cockpit windows, the mystery contact had moved into visual range, and what Morrison saw there made him question everything he thought he knew about aviation. The aircraft packing United 447 defied easy categorization. At first glance, Morrison thought it might be a modified business jet, but the proportions were wrong, too sleek, too angular, with control surfaces that suggested capabilities far beyond any civilian aircraft. Its matte gray finish seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and there were no visible markings or registration numbers. "Jesus Christ," Jenkins whispered, pressing his face to the side window. "What the hell is that thing?" Artemis studied the aircraft through binoculars she'd borrowed from the first aid kit. Her expression remained neutral, but Morrison caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "It's a prototype," she said finally. "Probably unmanned, definitely not in any official registry." The radio crackled again, but this time the voice was different, still electronically distorted, but carrying a cadence that suggested human origin rather than automated systems. "Phoenix 77, you are recognized. United 447, maintain current heading. You will receive further instructions in 60 seconds. Morrison felt his blood chill. "They know your call sign." "Yes," Artemis replied, her voice betraying nothing. But inside, her mind was racing through possibilities that grew darker with each passing moment. There were only a handful of people who would know her call sign and have access to the kind of aircraft currently flying alongside them. Most of those people were dead, killed in classified operations that officially never happened. "Phoenix 77, the voice continued, you will remember the Kandahar incident. Authorization Tango Whiskey 77. You have 90 seconds to acknowledge." The binoculars slipped from Artemis's hands, clattering to the cockpit floor. Morrison had never seen anyone go that pale that quickly. "What's the Kandahar incident?" he asked quietly. Artemis closed her eyes for 3 seconds, long enough to travel back 7 years to a moonless night over Afghanistan, where she'd made a decision that saved 200 Marines but cost her any chance at a normal life. The operation was so classified that its very existence was denied by 3 governments. Only 7 people knew the full details, and 6 of them were supposed to be dead. "Captain," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind, "I need you to understand something. What's about to happen? It's not random. Someone has been planning this for a very long time, and they've been waiting for me specifically to be on this aircraft." "That's impossible," Jenkins protested. "You're a passenger, how could anyone know?" "Because I'm not just any passenger." Artemis moved to the radio panel, her movements now carrying the fluid precision of someone activating long-dormant combat protocols. "My company, Veil Dynamics, supplies advanced materials to 70% of military aircraft manufacturers. My flight schedules are logged in systems that can be accessed by anyone with sufficient clearance." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "Someone has been tracking me. They knew I'd be on this flight, knew my background, knew exactly how to get me into this cockpit." Her finger hovered over the transmit button. "The question is whether they want me as an ally or a target." Morrison's training told him to contact authorities, declare an emergency, request immediate landing clearance. But something in Artemis's bearing, The way she transformed from passenger to commander in the space of minutes made him realize that conventional responses were no longer adequate. "What do you need from us?" he asked. "Trust," Artemis replied and keyed the microphone. "Kandahar acknowledged. Phoenix 77 is listening." The response came immediately, and when it did, Artemis's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Because the voice that answered was one she'd heard die in the flames of a crashed aircraft 7 years ago, in a place that didn't exist on any map, during an operation that had never officially happened. "Hello, Phoenix, it's been too long, we need to talk." The impossible voice belonged to Marcus "Ghost" Chen, her former wingman and the only person who'd ever matched her kill-to-loss ratio in combat. She'd watched his FA-18 spiral into the Afghan mountains, had listened to his final transmission as his aircraft disintegrated around him. His death had been confirmed by satellite imagery, wreckage analysis, and DNA evidence that she'd personally witnessed being collected. Yet here he was, speaking to her from an aircraft that shouldn't exist, orchestrating a situation that defied every protocol she'd ever learned. "Ghost?" The word escaped her lips as barely a whisper, but Morrison caught it. He saw the way her hands shook as she reached for the radio, saw the tears she was fighting back, and realized that whatever was happening transcended his understanding of aviation emergencies. "Impossible," she breathed into the microphone. "I was at your funeral. I gave your daughter the flag." "Artemis." Ghost's voice carried warmth that no electronic distortion could disguise. "There's so much you don't know, so much I couldn't tell you. But right now, I need you to listen very carefully, because 312 lives depend on what happens in the next 10 minutes. Morrison watched Artemis struggle with emotions that threatened to overwhelm her tactical thinking. This was beyond his experience, beyond his training, beyond anything he'd imagined possible when he'd pinned on his captain's wings. But he recognized one thing. The woman standing in his cockpit was no longer just a passenger or even a former military pilot. She was someone being drawn into a conflict that had followed her from a classified past into a very public present. "Ghost, I need proof," Artemis said, her voice regaining some of its professional edge. "Something only you would know." A pause. Then, "The night before Kandahar, you couldn't sleep. You sat in the ready room until 300, sketching aircraft designs on napkins. You told me you wanted to build something that could bring everyone home safe. You said the worst part of being a fighter pilot was watching good people die in bad machines." Artemis closed her eyes. No one else had been in that ready room. No one else had heard those words. Ghost Chen was alive, flying an aircraft that represented technology decades beyond anything she'd seen, and he just orchestrated the most complex aerial intercept in aviation history to get her attention. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to finish what we started in Kandahar," Ghost replied. "I want to save lives, and I want to offer you something that no one else in the world can provide, the chance to build that aircraft you were sketching, the one that brings everyone home safe." Morrison looked at his instruments, then at the woman who'd somehow become the focal point of an encounter that was rewriting everything he thought he knew about the sky. "What's your call, Commander?" Artemis straightened, and Morrison saw the exact moment when uncertainty transformed into resolve. The passenger was gone. The billionaire entrepreneur was gone. What remained was Phoenix 77, fighter pilot, protector of the innocent, and the only person aboard Flight 447 who understood that they were no longer dealing with a hijacking or terrorist threat. They were dealing with something far more complex. A ghost from a classified past offering salvation with one hand and holding 312 lives hostage with the other. The decision she made in the next 60 seconds would determine whether United Flight 447 became a footnote in aviation history or the opening chapter of something that would change the world forever. Ghost's voice crackled through the radio with an urgency that made Morrison's skin crawl. "Phoenix, We have approximately 8 minutes before this situation goes beyond my control. There are people who want you eliminated, people who know what you're capable of building, and they've been waiting for an opportunity like this." Artemis moved to the navigation console, her fingers flying over displays as she calculated distances, fuel consumption, and approach vectors. "Ghost, I need coordinates. Where are you taking us?" "Negative, too much traffic on these frequencies." A pause filled with electronic interference. "But Phoenix, remember the emergency protocols we developed for Operation Blackwater, the ones we never got to test." Morrison watched Artemis's face transform as she processed information he couldn't begin to understand. Her eyes moved in patterns that suggested she was visualizing three-dimensional spaces and calculating complex variables. This was how fighter pilots thought, not in straight lines but in spheres of possibility, where every decision created cascading consequences. "The high-speed intercept procedure," she said quietly. "But Ghost, that was theoretical. We never proved it would work with civilian aircraft." "We're about to prove it now." Ghost's aircraft moved closer to the 777, close enough that Morrison could see details that made his commercial pilot training feel utterly inadequate. The prototype's control surfaces were moving in ways that defied conventional aerodynamics. "Phoenix, I need you to understand something. The people tracking you, they've already moved against your company. Veil Dynamics is under federal investigation as of 2 hours ago. Assets frozen, employees detained for questioning." The words hit Artemis like physical blows. Her life's work, the company she'd built from her military experience, the revolutionary materials that were making aircraft safer, all of it was being destroyed while she sat trapped in an aluminum tube 7 miles above the earth. Why, she managed. "Because you got too close to something they want to keep buried. The materials you developed for civilian aircraft. They're derived from technology recovered during classified operations. Technology that officially doesn't exist, from missions that never happened." Ghost's voice carried a weight that spoke of years spent living with impossible secrets. "The Kandahar incident wasn't about enemy combatants, Phoenix. It was about recovering something that crashed in those mountains. Something that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of physics." Morrison felt the world shift beneath his feet. The comfortable reality of commercial aviation, predictable, regulated, explainable, was dissolving into something that belonged in the pages of science fiction. But the woman standing in his cockpit was treating these revelations with the grim acceptance of someone who'd always suspected the truth was darker than she'd been told. "The materials I've been developing," Artemis said slowly, "they're reverse-engineered from recovered technology." "From technology you helped recover," Ghost confirmed. "Your squadron didn't just provide air support that night. You were part of a deep black operation to secure artifacts that have implications for national security. The people who authorized that mission are dead, Phoenix. All of them except the ones who want to make sure the technology never reaches civilian hands." Jenkins looked between Morrison and Artemis, his confusion evident. "I don't understand any of this. What does classified military operations have to do with our passenger flight?" Artemis turned to face both pilots, and Morrison saw in her expression the terrible clarity that came with understanding the true scope of their situation. "Because this isn't a hijacking," she said. "It's an assassination attempt disguised as a terrorist incident. When this flight disappears, the official investigation will conclude that I was killed by foreign operatives trying to steal military secrets. Veil Dynamics will be disbanded, its research confiscated, and the technology will disappear into black programs where it can't threaten the people who want to control it." The radio crackled again, but this time the voice was different, crisp, official, and carrying the unmistakable authority of government command. "United 447, this is Colonel Harrison, NORAD. You are ordered to comply with previous instructions immediately. Failure to comply will result in defensive action." Ghost's voice cut through the official transmission. Phoenix, they're moving to intercept. You have 90 seconds to decide. Trust the system that's been lying to you for 7 years, or trust the wingman who died to protect what we found in those mountains. Morrison looked at his instruments, then at the horizon where he could see additional aircraft approaching. Dark specks that would soon resolve into fighter jets with orders to shoot down a commercial airliner, to protect secrets that existed in the shadowy space between official reality and the truth that got people killed. Artemis reached for the radio controls, her decision crystallizing with the brutal clarity of combat. She'd spent 7 years trying to forget the lesson that Kandahar had taught her. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy wasn't the one shooting at you, but the one giving you orders. The choice she made in the next 30 seconds would determine whether 312 innocent people lived or died, whether the truth about recovered technology remained buried, and whether Phoenix 77 would finally finish the mission that had started 7 years ago in the mountains of Afghanistan. Time slowed to the fractional seconds that existed between decision and action, where fighter pilots lived and died. Artemis's hand moved to the radio controls with the decisive motion of someone who just crossed a line from which there could be no return. Ghost, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same pilot who flew Kandahar. I've got 312 civilians aboard, and their safety takes priority over everything else. I know, Ghost replied, his voice carrying a warmth that transcended the electronic distortion. That's exactly why I chose you for this, Phoenix, because you never forgot that our job was protecting people, not protecting secrets. The approaching interceptors were now visible as distinct aircraft, F-22 Raptors, their angular stealth profiles unmistakable even at distance. Morrison's commercial pilot training screamed at him that this was the moment to comply with official orders, to trust the system, to believe that the United States Air Force would never shoot down a civilian airliner. But the woman standing behind him had experience with the gap between official policy and operational reality. Colonel Harrison, Artemis said into the microphone, this is Phoenix 77. I'm advising you that United 447 is not under hostile control. We have a situation that requires specialized handling. Phoenix 77, this is not your operation. Resume passenger status immediately. Harrison's voice carried the particular strain of an officer who'd been given orders that made no tactical sense but had to be followed anyway. Colonel, with respect, you don't have all the information. Artemis moved to the radar display, studying the geometry of approaching aircraft with the eye of someone who'd once planned similar intercepts. The aircraft you're tracking as hostile is piloted by someone with intimate knowledge of classified operations. If you engage, you'll be destroying evidence of technology that could revolutionize civilian aviation safety. A long pause filled with background chatter that suggested heated discussions in command centers across the region. Morrison watched Artemis work, recognizing leadership in action. She wasn't just communicating. She was managing a crisis that spanned military, civilian, and technological domains simultaneously. Ghost, she said, switching frequencies. I need options, real ones. Because in about 3 minutes, those Raptors are going to be in missile range, and I don't think Colonel Harrison has the authority to make the call that keeps us alive. There's a private airfield 40 miles northeast of our position, Ghost replied. Runway 725, 4,500 feet, ILS approach available. It's owned by a subsidiary of Vale Dynamics, officially for corporate aircraft, but it was actually built for situations exactly like this. Morrison's eyebrows rose. You built a private airfield for emergency landings. I built it for aircraft that needed to land without appearing on official flight plans, Artemis corrected. Sometimes the most important research happens off the books. She turned to Morrison with an expression that mixed determination and apology. Captain, I'm about to ask you to do something that goes against every regulation you've ever learned. But if we don't, Everyone aboard this aircraft is going to die to protect secrets that should have been revealed years ago. Morrison looked at his co-pilot, then at the woman who'd somehow become the focal point of a situation that defied his understanding of reality. His 20 years of experience told him to follow official orders, but his instincts as a pilot, the same instincts that had kept him alive through weather emergencies and mechanical failures, told him that the person most qualified to get them out of this situation alive was standing right behind him. "What do you need me to do?" "Trust me," Artemis said, reaching for the flight controls, "and prepare for an approach that's not in any manual you've ever read." Outside the cockpit windows, the F-22 Raptors had closed to visual range, their weapons systems undoubtedly tracking the commercial airliner that had become the center of a conflict between official reality and classified truth. In 90 seconds, someone would have to make a decision that would either end this crisis or escalate it beyond anyone's ability to control. Phoenix 77 was about to show why she'd been one of the most decorated fighter pilots in U.S. Navy history, and why some missions required skills that existed in the narrow space between courage and recklessness. The high-speed descent began without warning, pulling Morrison's stomach into his throat as Artemis initiated a maneuver that no commercial airliner was designed to execute. The 777 dropped from 37,000 feet like a controlled missile, its engines screaming as she pushed the aircraft beyond its normal operational envelope. "Jesus Christ!" Jenkins shouted, fighting against G-forces that pressed him back into his seat. "You're going to tear the wings off." "Negative," Artemis replied, her voice steady despite the tremendous stress on the airframe. "This aircraft is rated for greater stress than most pilots are willing to test. But Ghost, I need you to stay with us. If those Raptors try to match this descent profile, they're going to overshoot." Through the cockpit windows, Morrison watched the impossible unfold. Ghost's prototype aircraft maintained perfect formation with the diving 777, its control surfaces adjusting in ways that seemed to defy physics. Meanwhile, the F-22 Raptors struggled to match their descent rate, their advanced flight control systems preventing them from duplicating maneuvers that would destroy conventional aircraft. "Phoenix 77, this is Colonel Harrison. You are exceeding safe operational parameters. Level off immediately." "Colonel, we're demonstrating technology that your aircraft can't match," Artemis replied, simultaneously monitoring engine parameters and calculating approach vectors. "The prototype you've been tracking as hostile possesses flight characteristics that represent a generational leap beyond current fighter technology." The radio exploded with multiple voices, air traffic controllers demanding explanations, military commanders coordinating response options, and emergency services preparing for what looked like an inevitable crash. But Artemis filtered out the noise, focusing on the narrow band of variables that would determine whether 312 people lived or died in the next 6 minutes. "Morrison, I need you to configure for emergency landing," she said, her hands dancing over flight controls with the fluid precision of someone who'd learned to fly in situations where hesitation meant death. "Full flaps, landing gear down, approach speed 140 knots. "That's 20 knots below minimum safe approach speed," Morrison protested, even as his hands moved to comply with her instructions. "For a normal approach, yes." Artemis's eyes never left the flight display, where the private airfield was resolving from a distant waypoint into an actual runway. "But Ghost is going to provide assistance that's not in any flight manual." The prototype aircraft moved into position directly ahead of the 777, its exhaust creating a vortex pattern that Morrison initially interpreted as turbulence. But as they descended through 15,000 feet, he realized what was happening. Ghost was using his aircraft's wake to create a partial ground effect, reducing the air pressure above the 777's wings and allowing it to maintain lift at impossibly low speeds. "Formation flying," Morrison breathed in understanding. You're using his aircraft as an aerodynamic shield. It's a technique we developed for emergency recoveries, Artemis confirmed. Two aircraft flying in perfect synchronization can achieve flight characteristics that neither could accomplish alone. She paused, adjusting throttle settings with microscopic precision. The question is whether we can execute a procedure we've only tested with military aircraft using a commercial liner that weighs 4 times as much. The private airfield appeared below them, its runway looking impossibly short for an aircraft designed to land at major international airports. Morrison's experience told him they were approaching disaster, but his instruments were showing flight parameters that suggested controlled flight despite violating every conventional rule of aerodynamics. "Ghost, talk to me," Artemis said into the radio. "Distance to touchdown." 2 miles and closing. Phoenix, the Raptors are moving to intercept. We have maybe 90 seconds before someone makes a decision that gets people killed. Through the side windows, Morrison could see the F-22s adjusting their approach vectors, their weapon systems undoubtedly trained on the two aircraft that were demonstrating capabilities that weren't supposed to exist. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. If they completed this landing, they would prove that classified technology had been successfully adapted for civilian use. If they crashed, the evidence would be destroyed, and the official narrative would remain intact. "Colonel Harrison," Artemis transmitted on the emergency frequency, "we're demonstrating a controlled emergency landing using advanced aerodynamic techniques. Request that you hold your aircraft at safe distance and observe." Phoenix 7-7, "You are not authorized to test classified procedures with civilian passengers." "Colonel, with respect, I'm not testing anything. I'm saving lives using every tool available." Artemis's voice carried the absolute authority of someone who'd faced similar decisions before and lived with the consequences. "The choice is yours. Observe a successful emergency landing, or be responsible for shooting down a commercial airliner to protect technology that should be saving lives instead of taking them." 1 mile from touchdown. The runway ahead looked like a postage stamp, bordered by Colorado mountains that offered no margin for error. Morrison gripped his controls, ready to take over if the situation deteriorated beyond recovery. But the woman flying his aircraft moved with the confidence of someone who'd made similar approaches under enemy fire, where failure meant death for everyone depending on her skills. 30 seconds to touchdown. The moment of truth was approaching, where physics would determine whether classified technology and civilian aviation could coexist, or whether 312 people would die to protect secrets that existed in the shadow space between official reality and operational necessity. Phoenix 7-7 was about